Dr. Schwan. Um, my name is Melissa Rupp, and I am thrilled to be presenting with you today. I am an extension educator here for Ohio State University Extension, and give me 1 second while I get my screen situated. As I moved over, it disappeared on me. um, okay, well, we'll proceed anyway. So, uh, I don't even have I'm sorry. Give me 1 second here. The screen changed and I can no longer see my forward button. See if this will work. Okay, here we go. As with all of our programs with Ohio State University Extension, we are not endorsing names, vendors. We don't intend any discrimination or no intended endorsements of products. However, today you will hear definitely some trade names as I discuss some of the things that we've learned from a consumer perspective. So I am Melissa Rupp. I am an assistant professor of family consumer sciences here at Ohio State. My focus areas are financial well-being and financial literacy, and then food safety, food preservation being right there with it. And I enjoy both topics immensely. I'm in an accounting office. So today I wanted to bring to you a perspective from the county as we work with consumers. So we're exploring the emergence of domestic freeze drying, and how that has come into our communities and into our conversations, what we know and what we don't know. I feel a little wiser thanks to the last 30 minutes that we've spent together. Made a few notes myself. I sincerely appreciate the research that we can put that story together for consumers. So thank you for that, Dr. Schwan. And then one response to professional skill development that we did here in Ohio that I would like to share with you if it might be of help to you. Maybe 4 years ago, we were discussing within our team. We have a food preservation team across the state of Ohio. There's 12 members, and you can see the dots, or I should say the stars, across the state of Ohio. And we were discussing the different emerging topics within food preservation, and freeze drying seemed a little bit far off. It was kind of coming onto the scene, but the price point for the consumer seemed like it was going to be a non-issue for the foreseeable future. However, in conversations, I'd be testing a canner and somebody would say, we just got our tax return and we're going to buy a freeze dryer because we feel like this is the next best thing for us. Then another conversation would happen and, well, I think we're going to buy a freeze dryer with some inheritance money that we just received because we're trying to preserve for the future. And then the next person said, I'm going to buy a freeze dryer because my child is interested in entrepreneurship and we're going to sell candy. Now, I'm going to leave that right there on the table because there's so many more implications from that comment. But the conversations kept churning. And so we wanted to dive in deeper as a team, and we proceeded to do so. So our team has dealt with topics of water bath canning, pressure canning, freezing, dehydrating, pickling, all the things. And we've done that through presentations, workshops, webinar series, which there's a link at the end of my PowerPoint today that has our series that's available for viewing if you'd like. Blogs, fact sheets, social media. We've tried to cover all of it, but we hadn't covered the whole freeze drying. It was kind of out there, hadn't touched it, hadn't dove in. I am not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because Dr. Schwan was much more articulate on this topic. But if I could leave one thing with you, that freeze drying does pass through that instead of dehydrating and evaporating the water, it goes to a sublimation stage, which is the major difference. There's not a heat application in the same way that we're drying out that food, but we are, it's called lyophilization, that process, the mechanical method of making that process happen, which gives you a beautiful intact item. Just as you put it in, it'll come out, unless it's candy, then it kind of puffs up or changes form. But it's an extreme cold applied rapidly to food, and then introducing slight heat as that vapor starts to happen, that sublimation of that pull of the pressure, and it vacuums it out, and water comes pouring out of the pump. So we wanted to learn that process. We wanted to see the process, and it's a different way of approaching food preservation. So why? Why do this method, right? As we were talking with consumers, what was drawing them? Many people start with the conversation, well, freeze drying lasts 25 years. And I usually stop the conversation right there and say, why would you want to eat it in 25 years? But in seriousness, though, we don't have that research to prove it, not in a domestic kitchen and not with domestic tools. So emergency preparedness, having a storage of food for an emergent need, whether that be natural disaster, man-made disaster, a power outage of any kind, whatever that might look like. Emergency preparedness is always wise, and this is one tool towards that end. Garden, orchard, you have a supply and you're trying to elongate that storage. Those are another method. Another way to store your food, your freezer's full, your pantry's filled with canning jars, you've run out. It's another method to add to your variety of opportunities for preserving food for a future consumption. Healthy living. I personally have freeze-dried strawberries, bananas, and apples on my counter in my house right now. It is a snack. I love it. Camping, hunting, if you're a backpacker, there's a need for that. Food that could be taken, consumed in its raw state, or consumed after preparation, and can be a very helpful tool in those cases. And there's also an emerging population of people who are using freeze drying as pet food, as they use a protein or other food source for their animals in that preparation. So we wanted to teach the fundamentals to this population that's either newly purchased on the edge of purchasing, or considering a purchase, or just even wanting to know what this freeze drying thing is. So we look at the economics of the food preservation method, how that plays out financially. The uses of the freeze dried food, I've always taught, start with the end in mind. How will it be used? What's your intention? Also, foods that are effectively preserved in the freeze dryer and those that are effectively preserved in other methods. And then we talk a little bit about the consumer equipment purchase and what that equipment looks like, and the considerations for those choices. And then the storage of processed foods. So again, I think I'm very grateful for Carla going first, as she covered much of that from the scientific method. So the economics of freeze drying. I often will help consumers to understand that their choice in food preservation it's very seldom a cost saving activity. It depends on their source of their food and what they have available to them, as far as a freezer, electricity, canning jars, that type of thing. So the economics of freeze drying, again, once it's freeze dried, the storage is essentially free, but getting there can be costly. So the cost of the machine itself, the equipment, the primary freeze drying machine, is in the range of $2,000 to $10,000, depending on the model, the size, the capacities, and the package. Then you have the ongoing costs of each iteration of freeze drying. You have your Mylar bags. It could be glass jars, oxygen absorbers, and other equipment that you might need. So in the picture, you have a plastic bag. Those are, I think it's actually chunks of ice cream, but don't quote me on that. I'm trying to remember what that was right now. But we put it into a plastic container that has been vacuum sealed. So all those things cost money. The cost of the food, of course, running this dehydrator, this freeze dryer, you are looking at a minimum of 3 to 4 hours if you're doing something very simple, like perhaps a candy, all the way up to a 4 or 5 day run on something very moist, has a high liquidity. So the cost of electricity, and there's other costs of your time and labor and materials that you might need. So then talking to the consumer, what works in a freeze dryer? We still have limited access to proven recipes, to best practices. So the foods that work best in the freeze dryer, fruits, vegetables are fantastic. Dairy foods work very well. Proteins work very well. And we've done combination foods. And the pictures that you see on the screen right now, we attempted a Tex-Mex casserole. So on um, different uh, racks in the same freeze dryer. We put tater tots, corn, cheese, onions, cooked beef, and we put them all in the freeze dryer at the same time. And it took about 14 hours because they were all pre-frozen, and they were able to freeze dry and stabilize in about 14 hours. Once we removed them, we packaged them in sets of each of those items and sealed them up with an oxygen absorber and sealed them. We reconstituted it during our class that we did. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And we baked it, and it was quite tasty. Again, these are experimental processes. We don't have set recipes where those are emerging yet, but there's a lot to be learned yet in how we can support consumers in the process of reconstituting and utilizing their food. What we found to not work well, and others have said that may not work as well, is anything that's fat or oily. So I mentioned in the previous slide that we prepared taco meat as a beef. We browned it. We added taco seasoning. Prior to adding the taco seasoning, we rinsed the meat 4 times with hot water to rinse away in a colander to rinse away any remaining oiliness or greasiness to that meat. And then we added the seasoning, and it freeze dried beautifully. But oily things don't freeze dry well. High sugar things tend to puff up, and if not prepared, can actually cause your whole machine to become bound up with a sugar mess, and it can be very difficult to clean. Baked goods also do not pass through freeze drying in a way that makes them consumable, because reconstitution isn't necessarily possible in a way. It might be safe, but it might not be the quality safety conundrum that we sometimes have. So baked goods do not reconstitute well and do not come out of the freeze dryer in a ready to eat way that's enjoyable or has a high quality. So storing your freeze dried food, we talked a little bit about this in the first part of this call today, but we're looking at immediate use. As I mentioned, I have strawberries, bananas, and apples on my counter for my snacking. So glass jars, airtight storage containers, immediate use next week or so. Short-term storage, 1 to 6 months. We're looking at glass jar, Mylar bags work well. When you start talking about long-term storage, we want to keep it until a season or more beyond. We're looking at 1 to 10 years possibly. And I say 10 years because if in a little bit, we'll talk about the machines. It's only been available in domestic markets since 2014. The machines were patented and made available to the public and started in 2013 in Utah. And there's been some since then. So we don't have more than 10 years of data for any domestic use. Mylar bags are needed, and they have varying qualities. You have to check that out. Oxygen absorbers, a vacuum sealer, and then those totes or buckets in which to keep them sealed and safe. So oxygen absorbers are tricky little things. They must be used within 1 year of purchase. And once they're open, they need to be immediately used in the context of what you're using it and preserving, or they themselves need to be resealed or they will lose value. And like we say with anything that we preserve, we want to date, label the contents, the preparation method, and back to the comment about the chicken a few moments ago with Dr. Swan. Was it raw or was it cooked? Because that makes a big difference on the consumption end of that. The amount that's in that jar or that container, and then the reconstitution if that's relevant. I will often document the weight of a tray going into the freeze dryer and then the weight coming out to know the weight of the water loss from the content of the food that's there. So that's helpful for me, for my record keeping, as I continue to freeze dry and learn as I go. So we talked a little bit about the freeze drying equipment and the starter kits. Our team did a lot of investigating over our time together, and I'll talk about that process in a little bit. But we discovered there are four domestic companies that have freeze dryers available to the consumer. Harvest Right was started in Utah. They were established in 2013 and were begun being purchased in 2014 for consumer use. Stay Fresh hit the market in 2022, so just a couple years ago in California. Prep for Life, or it's commonly known as the Cube, and that came out in 2021. And I don't have an exact location, but it's a US market. And then the Blue Alpine, which is from 2021, they hit the market, and they're from Idaho. Now, the machines look like this. They are mostly tabletop machines, but each machine has different qualifications or different abilities for the consumer. So when you think about those purchases for the consumer, there's a lot to consider. How will you use it? Who all is going to use it? What's your batch size? What's your intentions? So Harvest Right has four sizes from small to extra large. I have a good friend who has a company in which they actually sell these. They have an industrial company, and she's told me she's never sold a small, and she sells many mediums and larges. The extra larges require special electrical systems in the place that you're running it, and causes that extra level of adaptation in your home to be able to run that machine. And they have a 3-year warranty. Stay Fresh has two sizes. We're looking at comparable prices from 2,600 up to that 5,000 range. The Cube is a little more expensive, has the capacity for 10 to 14 pounds of food, and the Blue Alpine is right there in that middle at about 3,000. And these numbers were as of the last 6 months. So when I'm teaching consumers, I let them know that perspective as well as they're making those choices. So when our team met, we looked at these considerations. It's very important to keep records because we don't have many proven, tested recipes, and we don't have large access to materials that are evidence-based. So keeping records of your practices, the product, the time drying, your results, the weather conditions. I appreciate Dr. Swan saying, in Georgia, the conditions are different for freeze drying and the end use than what would happen maybe in Ohio or California or Alaska. So those conditions are going to change the length of time for freeze drying and then the end use. Weighing your pans, as I mentioned before and after for moisture loss and reconstitution is critical to get that proportion appropriately edible. We recommend pre-freezing the food for 48 hours for energy efficiency, but I valued what was taught just a little bit ago, knowing that that trichinosis, that larva needed more than 48 hours for that efficiency and safety. So I'm looking at consumer efficiency with energy, and we're looking at safety in that consideration. If you're preparing raw food, be extra careful with cleaning that chamber. So just as indicating before, you have the chamber, you have the trays, we're cleaning them. But as you think about that moisture being pulled from the vacuum pump into the system, and if you have raw organisms in that chamber, that whole machine then has that exposure. So keeping that in mind, if you are going back and forth from raw chicken to strawberries, or even cooked chicken. So in handling it, another consideration, drying everything. Your hands, the seal, you pull the seal, wipe it down, making sure everything is completely and totally dry as you proceed. And also, one big hint is when shopping for materials, keeping your awareness of what you're purchasing, what you're looking for, what your desire is. Not everything is created equal, and paying attention to those material details. The size, the cc's of the oxygen absorbers, all the way to the depth and strength of the mylar bags. So what needs further research? I know we're all on a path of learning here. It's an emergent and a very present freeze drying community at this point. And the science-based resources that we have are limited and have not been widely available to consumers. We are starting to see them within the educational community, and we're building and learning from each other, but there's not tools to hand a consumer yet and to widely distribute. We don't know a lot about the methods for effectively reconstituting food for consumption. What works best? What's best practice? We have a lot of opportunities to build our recommendations for techniques, times, and storage of various types of food and for end use. That microbial understanding is emerging. Those foods processed raw and cooked, and the impact of those choices upon final use. And like I said, we just heard a little bit about that, and it's exciting to see that progress coming and that information being made available to us. And we are looking and continually researching that validated and tested recipes, just as we have for canning, pressure canning. This is the recipe, this is the time, this is the result for safety. And so that is something that is still emerging. So as we have this in Ohio and we are feeling that consumer push to stay ahead of that curve of understanding and learning, we opted about 4 years ago to start the conversation. About 2 years ago, I wrote a mini grant for funding to help us to just conduct this, food, using the machine, those types of things that all cost a little extra money. So about 9 months of planning, we got the job done. We gathered for 3 full days. We secured a machine for use that came to us brand new out of the box. And then one of our team members actually purchased it and is now using it in their office as an example machine for their teaching. But we gathered for those 3 days and we processed some meats, cheeses, veggies, fruit, and a little bit of candy, because that seems to be a hot market in our state. And a lot of, we're seeing a lot of trends in vendor shows and things and community sales. So we gathered, and in that time period, we learned the science of freeze drying. We learned the sight, smell, function, sounds, all of it from the machine. What is normal? So when a consumer calls and says, I'm at this stage and it sounds like this, our team now understands what they're talking about, so we can triage. We researched the history, we researched the machines, the types, and we experienced that machine operating. We became familiar with the prep, the considerations for prep, and the processing, the packaging, and labeling of that food. Also the taste, it was pretty good. So we produced it's about a 10-page triage paper that is only available internally for our team, but it's everything that we experienced, saw, thought of, question and answers that we've received. And we made a paper for our internal use. We produced a 4-blog series, and it's on a slide coming up, that talked about different aspects of the freeze drying consumer experience and the processing. We created social media posts to help promote that, and a PowerPoint lesson that was done by a team of 3 of our educators post lesson, using the resources that we learned in the lesson. And one of the most robust pieces that we had coming out of that time together was well over a couple hundred pictures of various stages, processes, equipment, notifications as the different screens were giving us notifications. We have pictures and documented all of it. I will say, if that picture component is of interest to you, we do have that library available and can be accessed by contacting our healthy people specialist, Laura Halliday. And if one of my team members that's on could put Laura's email in the chat, I would very much appreciate it. It's halliday.6@osu.edu. So you can reach out to her for those pictures if you have desired to see some of them or use them. This is our team post our final day. We had done a fair amount of processing and worked together, and it was a fantastic experience. We also have a webinar series. We touch a little bit on freeze drying in that series this year. I taught that back in May, but this link will take you to our webinar series from the last, I think, 4 years of webinars on various topics for food preservation. I mentioned a few of the resources. Shouts out to Penn State, Utah State. You have the most consumer-friendly and teachable resources, and we appreciate that. Shout out to our team that put the blog series together. That's available here on the screen as well. That's available for a resource for you to look up.